The clinking of ice in crystal, the low hum of self-congratulation, the scent of expensive perfume mingling with the roast beef. This was the native atmosphere of the Decker family. And for 3 years, Ethan had been learning to breathe this thin, rarefied air. He sat at the grand mahogany table in his father-in-law's mansion, a ghost in his own life, a silent observer at a feast held in his dishonor. His wife, Clara, beautiful and brittle, sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that looked like affection to the uninformed but felt like ownership to him. Across the table, Richard Decker, a man built for market booms and leverage buyouts, held court. His voice, a confident baritone that had crushed competitors and swayed city councils, was currently aimed, as it so often was, at Ethan. "So, Ethan," Richard began, a theatrical pause as he carved another slice of pink meat. "Still tinkering with your little drawings? Still designing imaginary houses for imaginary people?" The small group of family members, Clara's sycophantic brother, Marcus, and their quiet, complicit mother, Eleanor, offered a few polite, condescending chuckles. They were well rehearsed in this particular play. Ethan offered a small, practiced smile. "Something like that, Richard. Architecture is a slow build." He chose his words with the same care he used to draft a blueprint. "Solid, measured, weight-bearing. Slow build? Son, in my world, if you're slow, you're dead," Richard boomed, pointing his carving knife at Ethan for emphasis. "You've been with my daughter for 3 years. She's a Decker. She's used to a certain velocity. And what have you got to show for it? A rented office space and a portfolio of pipe dreams." Clara squeezed his arm, a silent warning. "Play along. Don't make a scene." He'd become fluent in her nonverbal language of control. "The right project takes time to find," Ethan said, his voice even. He could feel the familiar heat of frustration rising in his chest, a furnace he had learned to bank and control. They saw him as a mild-mannered, slightly disappointing hobbyist who had somehow lucked into marrying a Decker. They had no idea of the steel infrastructure that lay beneath his quiet exterior. "Time is money, Ethan. A concept you seem to struggle with," Richard said, finally sitting down. "Which brings me to that inheritance of yours. That patch of dirt your grandfather left you. Still holding on to it." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The land. It always came back to the land. 100 acres of rolling hills and scrubland, an hour outside the city. To them, it was a worthless, sentimental burden. To Ethan, it was a legacy, a promise. It was also the centerpiece of their long, slow-moving game. "It has sentimental value," Ethan replied, the same answer he always gave. "Sentiment doesn't pay the mortgage on a house like this," Marcus chimed in, gesturing around the opulent dining room. "Dad's being generous, even offering to take it off your hands. Do you any idea how much it costs just in property taxes?" "I manage," Ethan said softly. Clara leaned in, her whisper a silken thread of manipulation. "Darling, they're just trying to help. We're family. We want to see you succeed, to be unburdened." Unburdened. That was the word they used, as if they were lifting a great weight rather than preparing to fleece him. He felt a sudden, urgent need for air, for a space that wasn't filled with their suffocating condescension. "Excuse me," he said, placing his napkin on the table. "I need to check on a message." He stood and walked out of the dining room, his back straight, feeling their eyes on him. He could hear Richard's voice resume its boom, likely dissecting his lack of ambition for the 100th time. He walked down the marble-floored hallway, past portraits of Decker ancestors who stared down with the same smug certainty as their living descendant. He didn't go to the front door for air, nor did he pull out his phone. Instead, he stepped into the small library adjacent to the dining room, a room paneled in dark, fragrant cedar. He'd meant to just stand there for a moment, to gather himself, to reinforce the walls of his patience. He left the heavy door slightly ajar, a sliver of an opening. The sound from the dining room were muffled, indistinct. But then the tone shifted. The booming stopped. The voices dropped to a conspiratorial hush. He froze, his hand still on the doorknob. It was Clara's voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the silence. "He's weakening." The constant pressure is working. I think he's almost ready to sign the papers. A pause. Then Richard's gruff murmur. Good. The preliminary zoning reports are promising. We can't let him get wind of it. What's our final offer? 50,000, Clara replied instantly. For the whole 100 acres. He'll see it as a lifeline. A way to finally contribute something meaningful to our life together. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. $50,000. It was less than the cost of the chandelier hanging above the dining table. It was an insult wrapped in a pittance. Then came the words that stopped his heart. The words that shattered the carefully constructed facade of his marriage and his life. It was Clara again, her voice low, laced with a chilling, triumphant greed. Don't worry, Daddy. He'll sign. And once he signs, we take everything. The land, the money from the sale, will drain his accounts and file for divorce the next day. He'll be left with nothing but his precious drawings. Silence. Ethan held his breath, praying he had misheard, that this was some sort of grotesque misunderstanding. Then, Richard's chuckle, a low, guttural sound of pure avarice. That's my girl. Smart. Ruthless. A true Decker. In the cedar-scented library, standing in the shadows, Ethan felt the floor drop away. The man they were describing, the fool, the failure, the mark, was a stranger to him. They thought they were shearing a sheep. They had no idea they were prodding a sleeping lion. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, rock steady. The heat in his chest was no longer a banked furnace. It had cooled, hardened, and sharpened into something cold, clear, and absolute. The game had just changed. They had written the rules, set the board, and chosen the players. They just didn't realize he had been playing an entirely different game all along. Within 6 weeks, their world would be turned to ash, and he would be the one holding the match. It's incredible what you can learn when people think you aren't worth listening to, isn't it? When they see you as nothing more than a piece of furniture in their grand design. They get careless. They whisper secrets. My name is Ethan, and what you just heard was the moment my life split into 2 distinct parts. The life I thought I had, and the one that was about to begin. If you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever had to bite your tongue while someone belittled you, then stick around. This story is for you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're ready to see how this plays out, make sure you're subscribed, because the fallout is just getting started. The walk back to the dining table was the longest of Ethan's life. Each step on the cold marble was a conscious effort, a triumph over the screaming instinct to turn, to confront, to unleash the cataclysm that was brewing inside him. He could feel the tectonic plates of his world shifting, grinding against each other, preparing for an earthquake that only he knew was coming. But his face remained a mask of placid calm. This was the first rule of the new game. Show them nothing. Let them continue to believe they were in complete control. He re-entered the dining room. The conversation ceased for a moment, all eyes turning to him. He saw the flicker of annoyance in Clara's eyes, quickly veiled by a concerned smile. He saw the open contempt on Richard's face, a man inconvenienced by the return of a nonentity. "Everything all right, darling?" Clara asked, her tone dripping with manufactured sweetness. "Fine," Ethan said, his voice a marvel of control. He resumed his seat. Just a message from a client. A small revision on a project. He deliberately made it sound trivial, unimportant. He saw the look exchange between Clara and her father. See? Little drawings. Pipe dreams. "Well, don't let your hobbies interrupt a family dinner," Richard grunted, already turning his attention to the wine bottle. "Eleanor, pour me another glass." And Ethan, we were just discussing your land again. I've had my lawyers draw up a preliminary offer. A very generous one, I might add. $50,000. Cash. It will be a nice little nest egg for you and Clara. You could finally invest in a real business, maybe a franchise. Something with a proven model. Ethan looked at his father-in-law. The man's audacity was almost architectural in its scale and complexity. He was offering a pittance for a gold mine and calling it generosity, a lifeline. The phrase Clara had used. They had rehearsed this. The casual mention of the offer, the amount, the suggestion of what he could do with the money. It was all part of the script. a script he now possessed. He picked up his fork and pushed a piece of asparagus around his plate. He needed to think, not about what he would do, that was already crystallizing in his mind with terrifying clarity, but about how. Vengeance was a blunt instrument. Justice, however, required precision. It required a blueprint, and Ethan was, above all else, an architect. He thought back to the beginning, 3.5 years ago. He had met Clara at a gallery opening. He was there to appreciate the art, a collection of stark, beautiful photography. She was there to be seen. He had been sketching the way the light fell across a particular sculpture when she approached him. She'd been charmed, she said, by his quiet focus, by the intensity in his eyes. She said he was a refreshing change from the loud, aggressive men in her circle. At the time, he believed her. He was a successful, if low-profile, architect. After years of working for a large, soul-crushing firm, he had struck out on his own. But he did it differently. He founded 2 companies. One was Ethan Vance Designs, his public-facing, small-scale business that took on modest residential projects and passion project renovations. This was the company the Deckers knew. It kept him grounded, connected to the craft. His other venture was a silent partnership. He was the founder and principal designer of a firm known only as Ethelred. The name was a nod to an old English king, a private joke. Ethelred was an anonymous, almost mythical entity in the world of high-concept architecture. They took on only a handful of massive, cutting-edge commercial and civic projects a year. They were known for their innovative use of sustainable materials and structures that were both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally efficient. Ethelred was his art, his passion, and his fortune. The firm was structured through layers of legal protection and managed by his old mentor and trusted partner, a man named Julian Croft. No one connected the quiet, unassuming Ethan Vance with the visionary powerhouse of Ethelred. It was a separation he had cultivated deliberately, preferring the work to the fame. When he met Clara, he let her believe he was the former, the struggling artist. He wanted to be loved for who he was, not for the balance in his hidden bank accounts. For a while, it seemed to work. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed to admire his dedication. But soon, the first cracks appeared. Her fascination with his artistic soul began to curdle into impatience with his lack of ambition. Her family, the formidable Deckers, only amplified this pressure. They saw his modesty as weakness, his patience as laziness, his integrity as naivete. They moved him around their lives like a piece of furniture they found vaguely disappointing but hadn't yet gotten around to replacing. And he had let them. He had endured the endless barbs from Richard, the condescending advice from Marcus, and Clara's increasingly sharp-edged manipulations, all because he believed in the foundation of their marriage. He thought it was a structure that could be reinforced, that the cosmetic flaws could be fixed. He now understood the truth. The foundation itself was rotten. It wasn't a house in need of renovation. It was a facade, a Hollywood set, and behind it, there was nothing but greed and scaffolding. $50,000 is a lot of money, Richard, Ethan said, his voice carefully pitched to sound grateful, perhaps a little overwhelmed. This was his first move in the new game. Let them think their strategy was working. Richard's chest puffed out. It is, and it's more than that patch of weeds is worth. I'd be taking a loss, frankly, doing it as a favor. For Clara, he glanced at his daughter, a king bestowing a gift. I'll need to think about it, Ethan said, looking down at his plate. He needed to appear hesitant, weak, like a man wrestling with pride, but tempted by the money. Think about it. Richard scoffed. What's there to think about? The offer is on the table today. It might not be there tomorrow. Markets change. He was using classic negotiation tactics, creating false urgency. It was insultingly transparent. He's right, honey, Clara said, her voice a gentle purr. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for. A fresh start. For us. For us. The words were acid in his ears. The us she envisioned was her father, and his money. He was just the obstacle to be removed. He looked up and met her eyes. He searched for a flicker of doubt. a hint of the woman he thought he had married. He found nothing, only a polished, impenetrable surface. The knowledge of her betrayal was a physical presence between them, a ghost at the feast only he could see. "You're right," he said slowly, deliberately. "It's an important decision. It would change everything." A slow smile spread across Richard's face. The shark was sensing blood in the water. "Exactly. It's time you started thinking like a man with a future, Ethan. A Decker future." Ethan simply nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak further. He finished the rest of the dinner in near silence, letting their conversation about money, power, and influence wash over him. It was no longer just noise. It was data. Every arrogant statement, every casual dismissal of ethics, every greedy assumption, it was all ammunition. He was no longer just building a defense. He was designing a fortress, and from within its walls, he would lay siege to their entire world. The meal ended. The goodbyes were said. In the car, Clara was effusive, triumphant. "I'm so proud of you, darling," she said, placing her hand on his thigh. "You're finally seeing the bigger picture." Dad was really impressed. Ethan just kept his eyes on the road. "He has a way of making his point," he said, the ambiguity lost on her. "He just wants what's best for us," she said. $50,000. Can you imagine? "I'm trying to," Ethan said, his voice flat. Oh, he could imagine. He could imagine it with a clarity that would terrify her. He could see the path ahead, every step, every move, every countermove. They thought they were closing a deal. They had no idea they were walking into a trap of his own design. The architect was about to teach them the true meaning of a slow build. The days that followed the dinner party were a masterclass in psychological warfare, with Ethan as the sole, silent combatant. On the surface, life continued as normal. He went to his small, quiet office. He met with the clients for his public-facing business, discussing kitchen renovations and patio extensions with genuine interest. He came home to the immaculate, sterile house he and Clara shared, a house that felt less like a home and more like a showroom for the Decker lifestyle. But beneath this placid surface, a furious, methodical current was moving. Clara, believing him to be on the hook, escalated her campaign. Her methods were a mixture of cloying affection and subtle pressure. One morning, as he was getting dressed, she came into their walk-in closet, an armful of her latest shopping conquests. "I saw the most beautiful watch today, darling," she said, draping a silk blouse over a hanger. "A Patek Philippe. It would look incredible on you." It just screamed success. She paused, then added with a theatrical sigh. "Of course, it's ridiculously expensive. A person would need a little windfall to even consider it." Ethan, buttoning his simple, well-made but unbranded shirt, merely nodded. "Sounds nice," he said. He knew this game. She was dangling the trappings of the world she valued, suggesting that signing the papers was the key to unlocking it all. It was a world of things, of status symbols meant to fill the void where substance should be. "Once we have a little more financial freedom," she continued, trailing a perfectly manicured finger down his arm, "we could do so much. Travel. Really travel, not just those little weekend trips you like. We could go to Monaco for the Grand Prix. We could buy a summer place in the Hamptons. Don't you want that for us?" He turned to face her, looking directly into her eyes. "What I want, Clara, is for us to be happy." Her face softened into a practiced expression of tenderness. "Me too, baby. And this is how. This will solve everything." He was amazed at her audacity, her complete lack of any discernible conscience. She could stand there, planning his financial ruin, and speak of their happiness in the same breath. It was like watching a spider spin a beautiful web for a fly, whispering sweet nothings all the while. The pressure from Richard was more direct, less refined. He would call Ethan at his office, his voice booming through the phone. "Ethan, Richard Decker here. Have you given any more thought to my generous offer? I've got investors lining up for a new project, and I need to know if I can acquire that parcel. Time is of the essence. I'm still considering the legal implications." "Richard," Ethan would reply calmly, sitting at his drafting table. On the table were not the plans for a suburban patio, but a preliminary schematic for a massive, multi-billion-dollar corporate campus. The project title at the top of the page read, Project Nightingale. It was Ethelred's latest and most ambitious undertaking. Legal implications? Richard would laugh, a harsh, dismissive sound. Son, it's a simple land sale. My lawyers will handle everything. You don't need to worry your pretty little head about the details. Just show up and sign. I'm trying to make you a rich man. A rich man. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Ethan's net worth, carefully managed and silently growing through Ethelred, was already more than 10 times that of Richard Decker's entire portfolio. Richard, who built his empire on bluster and risky leverage, had no concept of true, quiet wealth. He only understood the loud, flashy kind. The most painful moments of humiliation, however, came in public. The Deckers insisted on parading Ethan around their social functions, using his perceived meekness as a foil to their own magnificence. A charity gala at the City Museum was a particularly galling example. Ethan, in a perfectly tailored but understated tuxedo, was standing by a display of ancient pottery when Richard cornered him with a group of his portly, cigar-chomping associates. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my son-in-law, Ethan," Richard announced, slinging a heavy arm around Ethan's shoulders. "He's the artist in the family." The men looked Ethan up and down, their eyes assessing and dismissing him in a single glance. They saw his lack of a brand-name watch, his quiet demeanor, his refusal to join their loud, braying laughter. "An artist?" One of the men, a property developer named Henderson, grunted. "Can't be much money in that." "Oh, Ethan's not concerned with money," Richard said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "He's a man of sentiment. In fact, he's sitting on 100 acres of prime real estate, or what will be prime real estate once I develop it, and he's hesitant to sell. Thinks it has sentimental value." The men chuckled. Henderson clapped Ethan on the back, a little too hard. "Son, let me give you a piece of advice. The only thing sentimental about a piece of dirt is the number on the check you get for selling it. Don't be a fool." Ethan simply smiled, a tight, polite expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate the advice, Mr. Henderson." He could feel Clara watching from across the room, her face a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance at his very existence. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of loneliness. He was an island in a sea of sharks, and the only person who was supposed to be his harbor was secretly chumming the water. He excused himself and walked out onto a small balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air was a relief. The city spread out before him, a glittering tapestry of lights. He could pick out the buildings he had designed as Ethelred, the sleek, twisting spire of the Helios Tower, the cantilevered marvel of the Viridian Bridge, the sprawling green-roof campus of a tech giant. His work, his legacy, was woven into the very fabric of the metropolis. And in a room just a few feet away, he was being mocked as a failure by men who couldn't design a functional garden shed. He pulled out his phone, not to check messages, but to look at a photograph. It was of him and his grandfather, taken 20 years ago, standing on the very land the Deckers were so desperate to steal. His grandfather was a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, a man of profound integrity. He had bought the land piece by piece over his lifetime, not as an investment, but as a sanctuary. "They're not making any more of it, Ethan," he used to say. "Land is real. It's honest." Before he died, he had given Ethan the deed, enclosed in a worn, brown leather folio. "Don't you ever let anyone trick you out of this," his grandfather had warned, his eyes sharp and knowing. "People will see a quiet boy and think he's a simple boy. Don't you ever let them mistake your kindness for weakness." Ethan had kept that folio with him always. It was in his briefcase at the office. It was a tangible link to the man who had taught him the difference between price and value. The Deckers saw the price of everything and the value of nothing, especially not him. A wave of cold resolve washed over him. The humiliation didn't sting anymore. It was fuel. Every condescending word, every dismissive glance, was another brick in the fortress he was building. They thought they were breaking him down. They were actually making him stronger, hardening his will, clarifying his purpose. He returned to the gala, his calm demeanor perfectly restored. He found Clara, who was chatting with a group of women who looked like they were sculpted from porcelain in judgment. "There you are," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Are you ready to go? You look a little tired." It was her way of saying his presence was no longer required, that he had served his purpose as her social accessory. "Almost," he said. As they were walking towards the exit, they passed Richard and his cronies again. "Ah, Itan," Richard called out. "Leaving so soon? We were just talking about the future of the waterfront. Big things. Things you wouldn't understand." Ethan paused. He looked Richard directly in the eye. "You might be surprised by what I understand, Richard," he said, his voice soft, yet carrying an unusual weight. For the first time, a flicker of something, not understanding, but perhaps confusion, crossed Richard's face. It was a slight deviation from the script, a note played in a different key. It was nothing, a momentary anomaly. But for Ethan, it was the first tremor, the first sign of the earthquake to come. He had let them push him, humiliate him, and underestimate him. Now, the quiet preparation was over. It was time to start pushing back. The following week, Ethan began to subtly shift the dynamics. His actions were small, almost imperceptible, but they were all part of a larger, carefully orchestrated design. He was like an architect surveying a site, noting the stresses and weaknesses of the existing structure before drawing up the plans for its demolition. His first move was to engage a new lawyer, not a local attorney, but a shark from a top-tier metropolitan firm, a woman named Isabella Rossi, who specialized in complex corporate litigation and asset protection. He met her not in a stuffy office, but in the airy, sunlit atrium of the Helios Tower, one of Ethelred's signature buildings. "Mr. Vance," she said, her handshake firm, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "Julian Croft speaks very highly of you. He said you have a unique situation." Ethan smiled. Julian, his mentor and the public face of Ethelred, had been his staunchest ally. "Unique is one word for it," Ethan replied. He spent the next hour laying out the entire situation. He told her about the land, the zoning information he had access to as Ethelred, the impending highway project that would make its value skyrocket. He told her about the Deckers, about the $50,000 offer, and the Overheard conversation. He spared no detail, his voice calm and methodical as he recounted years of quiet humiliation. Isabella Rossi listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice a low purr, "this isn't just a case. This is a work of art. They've handed you every tool you need to dismantle them, piece by piece. The fraudulent inducement, the conspiracy, the emotional distress. It's a symphony of malfeasance. I'm not interested in a messy, public lawsuit," Ethan stated clearly. "That's not my way. I don't want to destroy them. I want them to understand. I want to hold up a mirror. The moral mirror," Rossi mused, tapping a pen against her notepad. "An elegant but devastating strategy. Forcing an antagonist to confront the full scope of their actions in a single, inescapable moment. I like it. So what's the plan?" "They want me to sign a document," Ethan said. "So I will, but it won't be their document. It will be mine." Together, they began to draft the counteroffensive. It was a complex and beautiful piece of legal architecture. It involved shell corporations, timed releases of information, and a series of contractual clauses that would spring like traps. Meanwhile, at home, Ethan played his part with chilling perfection. He allowed a subtle air of defeat to color his demeanor. He sighed more often. He seemed distracted, worried. He let Clara discover a stack of unpaid bills on his desk, bills he had already paid from a different account, to reinforce their narrative of his financial incompetence. "Oh, Ethan," she said one evening, holding up a final notice from an internet provider. Her voice was a perfect blend of pity and exasperation. "You can't keep letting things slide like this. How are we ever going to get ahead?" "I'm trying, Clara," he said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration he had practiced in a mirror. "It's just a lot right now." "I know, baby, I know," she said, coming up behind him and wrapping her arms around his neck. That's why Dad's offer is such a blessing. It would take all this pressure right off your shoulders. You could finally breathe. He could feel her breath on his neck, her words like a poison dart. She was so close to her prize, she could taste it. Her confidence made her careless. That weekend, she insisted they go to the Decker estate for Sunday brunch. "It's time," she whispered to him in the car. "I think you should tell Dad you're ready to accept. It would make him so happy." The brunch was another trial by fire. Richard was in rare form, pontificating about a new luxury condo development he was planning. "The centerpiece," he announced to the family, "will be the Overheard Tower. We're in negotiations to license the name and a signature design. They're the best in the business. Elusive, expensive, but worth every penny. Having that name attached will double the value of the units overnight." Ethan nearly choked on his orange juice. The sheer, breathtaking irony of it was almost too much to bear. Richard Decker, the man who called him a failure and a hobbyist, was fawning over his own anonymous creation. Project Nightingale, the corporate campus Ethan was currently designing, was a joint venture with the city's largest construction firm, Harrison Holdings. Its CEO, Robert Harrison, was an old friend of Julian's and one of the few people who knew Ethan's secret. Richard had been trying for months to get a meeting with Harrison Holdings to partner on his waterfront project, but had been repeatedly rebuffed. "Can you even get a meeting with Ethelred?" Marcus asked, his mouth full of croissant. "I heard they're impossible to reach." "I have my ways," Richard said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The top is a small circle, Marcus. We all know each other." Ethan kept his eyes on his plate, a small, private smile touching his lips. Richard wasn't in the circle. He wasn't even in the same city as the circle. After the meal, as they were having coffee in the drawing room, Ethan took a deep breath. It was time to set the hook. "Richard," he began, his voice quiet, drawing the attention of the room. He stood up and walked to the fireplace, standing before them. "Clara and I have been talking, and you were right. I've been letting sentiment get in the way of progress. Of our future." Clara beamed, shooting her father a triumphant look. Richard leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "I'm ready to accept your offer," Ethan said. "The $50,000 for the land." A wave of relief and victory washed over the room. Eleanor, the silent mother, gave a rare, small smile. Marcus gave a little yes under his breath. Clara rushed to Ethan's side, kissing him on the cheek. "Oh, darling, that's wonderful news." Richard stood up, a broad, magnanimous smile on his face. He clapped Ethan on the shoulder, the same patronizing gesture he always used. "Son, you've just made the smartest decision of your life. I'm proud of you. You're finally thinking like a businessman." "There's just one condition," Ethan said, his voice still soft. Richard's smile tightened slightly. "A condition? It's a bit silly, I suppose," Ethan said, looking down as if embarrassed. "It's that leather folio the deed is in. It was my grandfather's. It's the only thing I want to keep. I'd like to do the signing, the final transfer at my house. And I'd like to do it from the folio itself. A sort of final goodbye to it." He looked up, his expression painfully earnest. "It's a sentimental request, I know." Richard relaxed, a wave of contemptuous pity washing over his features. "Sentiment? Of course. Fine, Ethan. If you want to have a little ceremony, we'll have a little ceremony. My lawyer will meet us at your house. When do you want to do this?" "Next Friday," Ethan said. At noon, he had chosen the date and time with care. It was the exact moment that the City Planning Commission's agenda for the new highway project would be made public. "Friday it is," Richard boomed, extending his hand. "Welcome to the family, son. For real this time." Ethan shook his hand. The grip was firm, confident. The grip of a man who believed he had just won everything. As Ethan felt the man's fleshy palm against his own, he thought of his grandfather. Don't you ever let them mistake your kindness for weakness. The quiet preparation was over. The stage was set. The audience was assembled. All that was left was the final act. And as he looked at the smiling, triumphant faces of the family that had tried to break him, he knew the finale would be spectacular. He was no longer just the architect of buildings. He was the architect of their downfall. The week leading up to the signing was a study in contrasts. For the Deckers, It was a week of celebration and barely concealed avarice. For Ethan, it was the quiet, methodical final phase of a complex demolition. He moved through the days with a preternatural calm, a man walking through a house he knew was scheduled to be razed, noting the cracks in the walls and the sag of the foundation one last time. Clara was a whirlwind of future plans, all predicated on the imminent $50,000 infusion and the subsequent divorce settlement she believed would follow. She spent hours on her laptop, browsing luxury travel sites and real estate listings for chic downtown condos. "Look at this one, Ethan," she said one evening, turning her screen toward him. It showed a sterile, glass-walled apartment with a view of the city. It has a concierge service and a rooftop pool. Wouldn't it be amazing to live somewhere like this? So much more us. It's very modern, Ethan commented, his eyes on the book he was reading. It was a biography of Marcus Aurelius. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. The words resonated deep in his soul. His goal was not to become as cruel and grasping as they were. It was to hold a mirror up to their nature, not to adopt it. "Modern is the future," Clara said, misinterpreting his detachment as acquiescence. "That dusty old house you inherited from your parents is so provincial. We could sell it, take the money from the land, and start fresh. A real power couple." He simply nodded, turning a page. Every word she spoke was another nail in her own coffin. She was so blinded by her vision of a future without him that she was building his case for him, providing a running commentary on her own premeditated fraud. Richard, meanwhile, was insufferably smug. He called twice that week, not to rush Ethan but to gloat. "Just want to check in, son," he said, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "My team is already doing soil tests on your old property." "Well, my old property, soon enough. We're going to build something magnificent there. Something that will last." "I'm sure you will," Ethan said, looking at the Ethelred blueprints for Project Nightingale, which was slated for that very land. It was indeed magnificent, and it would last. But it would have Richard Decker's name nowhere near it. "And listen," Richard continued, "about that Ethelred project I mentioned. I'm making real headway. I pulled some strings, and I've got a preliminary meeting set up with their front man, Julian Croft. He's a tough old bird, but he'll see the value in partnering with Decker Development." Ethan's grip tightened on his pen. "Is that so? When is the meeting?" "Next Friday afternoon," Richard said proudly. "Right after we sign the papers at your place. I'll go straight from making you a moderately well-off man to making myself a monumentally wealthy one. It's going to be a banner day." The symmetry was poetic. Richard was planning to walk directly from his act of petty theft into a meeting with the very man he was stealing from. Ethan felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The trap was not just set. The bait was irresistible. On Thursday, the day before the signing, Ethan made his final preparations. He met with Isabella Rossi one last time. They went over the documents he had prepared, which were now nestled inside his grandfather's worn leather folio. The folio contained 2 sets of papers. On top was Richard's original, offensively simple land sale agreement. Beneath it, separated by a divider, was Ethan's version. It was a multi-page, ironclad contract that looked, at first glance, like a standard agreement, but was laced with devastating clauses. Clause 4A stated that the seller, Ethan Vance, attested to the land's current valuation being based on publicly available information, but the buyer, Decker Development, by signing, assumed all risk and waived all claims related to future zoning changes or value appraisals. It was a standard-looking clause that would utterly defang them. Clause 7B was the masterstroke. It was a conditional partnership agreement. It stipulated that if the buyer, Decker Development, entered into any negotiation or contract related to the architectural firm Ethelred within 12 months of the sale, they would automatically trigger a partnership audit. This audit would grant Ethan's designated legal team full access to all of Decker Development's financial records and communications. It was a Trojan horse, a legal bomb hidden in plain sight. But the most important document was the final page, a sworn affidavit, signed by Ethan and notarized, detailing the conversation he had overheard at the dinner party. It listed the date, the time, the people present, and the exact words spoken. Once he signs, we take everything. Are you ready for this, Ethan? Isabella asked, her gaze steady. Once you start this, there's no going back. Your marriage, your relationship with this family, it all ends tomorrow. Ethan looked out the window of her office. It already ended, he said quietly. It ended in a cedar-paneled library when I heard my wife plotting my ruin. Tomorrow is just the epilogue. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was thick with a strange, celebratory tension. Clara had ordered from their favorite expensive restaurant. She lit candles. She put on soft music. It was a grotesque parody of a romantic evening. She was celebrating the end of their life together, and she thought he was celebrating with her. A toast, she said, raising her wine glass. To new beginnings. Ethan raised his glass. To new beginnings, he echoed, his voice devoid of the irony she couldn't hear. He looked at her across the table, the candlelight flickering in her eyes. He felt a pang, not of love but of loss. Not for the woman she was, but for the woman he had once believed her to be. It was the last moment of the quiet before the storm. The final, deep breath before the plunge. The next morning, he woke early. He dressed with meticulous care in a simple, dark suit, a white shirt, and a conservative tie. He was dressing not for a business deal, but for a funeral. The funeral of his old life. At 11:30, he stood in his living room, a room filled with furniture Clara had chosen, art she had approved. It was her space. He was just a guest. He placed the leather folio on the polished surface of the coffee table. He ran his hand over the worn leather, feeling the familiar texture, the faint indentation of his grandfather's thumbprint near the clasp. It was a shield. It was a weapon. At 11:45, the doorbell rang. It was Richard's lawyer, a slick, reptilian man named Peterson, carrying a briefcase. At 11:55, a black luxury sedan pulled into the driveway. Richard, Marcus, and Clara emerged. They walked up the path, their faces wreathed in confident smiles. They were arriving for a victory celebration. Ethan opened the door. "Ethan, my boy," Richard boomed, striding into the house as if he owned it. "Ready to make history?" "Everything is ready," Ethan said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling currents of their greed. He gestured them into the living room. They all sat down. Richard, in the main armchair, the king on his throne. Clara, next to Ethan on the sofa, her proximity a final, desperate act of performance. Marcus, pacing nervously, like a jackal waiting for the lion to finish his meal. "Well, let's get to it," Richard said, rubbing his hands together. "Peterson, you have the papers?" The lawyer produced the document. Simple. 2 pages. An insult in legalese. "Right," Richard said. "Ethan, you look this over, sign on the dotted line, and my lawyer here will witness and notarize. Then Clara will countersign, and I will hand you a cashier's check for $50,000. He said the amount as if he were bestowing the crown jewels. Ethan didn't look at their document. Instead, he reached for his grandfather's folio. He opened it with deliberate slowness. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a ridiculously ornate clock on the mantelpiece, a housewarming gift from the Deckers. "As I said," Ethan began, his voice filling the quiet room, "I wanted to do this my way." A final moment of sentiment. He slid Richard's contract across the table, leaving it untouched. Then he pulled out his own set of documents. They were thicker, more substantial. He fanned them out slightly. "This is my copy," he said. "My lawyer, Ms. Rossi, reviewed your offer and made a few standard adjustments for my protection. I'm sure you'll find them agreeable. It's the same price, the same essential agreement." Richard frowned, a flicker of annoyance. This was an unexpected complication, a bump in the smooth road to his victory. "Adjustments? What adjustments?" "I told you my lawyers would handle it. Just standard boilerplate," Ethan said reassuringly. "You can look it over. Or, to save time, you could just sign my copy. It's all the same." He pushed a stack of papers toward the center of the table. He then took out a pen, a simple, elegant fountain pen. He uncapped it and placed it next to the documents. The quiet click echoed in the tense silence. Clara leaned toward him, her whisper sharp. "Ethan, what are you doing? Don't complicate this. Just sign his papers." Ethan ignored her. He looked directly at Richard. "It's your choice, Richard. We could spend an hour having Mr. Peterson read every line, or you can trust that this is what we agreed to, and we can finish this before your big meeting with Mr. Croft. The one you have this afternoon." The mention of the meeting, of the time constraint, worked exactly as he'd planned. Richard's greed for the Ethelred deal warred with his suspicion. Greed won. It always did with Richard. "Fine," he snapped, his patience gone. "Give me the damn thing." He snatched the papers from the table. He glanced at the first page, saw the familiar names and the property description. He flipped to the last page, saw the signature line. He didn't read the dense paragraphs in between. Why would he? He was dealing with Ethan, the simple, sentimental fool. "Where do I sign?" he barked. Ethan pointed to the line at the bottom of the last page. "Right there, as the buyer." Richard took the fountain pen. He scribbled his name with a flourish, a signature that looked like a declaration of war. He slid the document over to Clara. "You next." As his wife, Clara signed without a moment's hesitation, her signature a delicate, looping script that belied the treachery behind it. Then they all looked at Ethan. It was his turn, the final step. Ethan picked up the pen. He looked at the paper. He looked at their expectant, greedy faces. He could feel the weight of the last 3 years of every insult, every condescending smile, every whispered plot. He held the pen just above the signature line. The room was utterly still. And then the doorbell rang. The sudden, sharp chime of the doorbell shattered the tense silence in the room. Everyone flinched, their eyes darting towards the door. Richard shot Ethan a look of pure irritation. "Are you expecting someone, Ethan?" he demanded, his voice tight. "This is a private family matter." "I am," Ethan said calmly, placing the pen down on the table, next to the unsigned line. The performance was not yet complete. The final actor had just arrived. "I asked a colleague to join us, to act as my witness." "Your witness?" Richard scoffed. "Peterson is a notary. That's all the witness you need." "Who is this?" Before Ethan could answer, the door opened. Standing in the entryway was not some junior associate from Ethan's small firm. It was a man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair, an impeccably tailored suit, and an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He was Robert Harrison, the CEO of Harrison Holdings, the largest and most respected construction firm in the city. He was a titan of the industry, a man Richard Decker had been desperately trying to get a meeting with for over a year. Richard's jaw went slack. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant triumph, was now a canvas of utter confusion. Marcus stared, his mouth agape. "Harrison," Richard stammered, scrambling to his feet. "Mr. Harrison, what are you doing here?" Robert Harrison ignored him completely. His gaze was fixed on Ethan. He walked into the room, his expensive leather shoes making almost no sound on the hardwood floor. He smiled warmly, a genuine expression that was a stark contrast to the false smiles of the Deckers. "Ethan," Harrison said, his voice a rich, pleasant baritone. "Sorry I'm a few minutes late. The traffic on the west side was murder." "Robert, thank you for coming," Ethan said, standing to greet him. "You're right on time." The two men shook hands, a gesture of familiar ease and mutual respect. To the Deckers, this was like watching a dog walk on its hind legs and recite Shakespeare. The universe had ceased to make sense. "I don't understand," Clara said, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. She was looking back and forth between Ethan, the man she thought was a failure, and Robert Harrison, the epitome of success. "How do you two know each other?" Harrison turned his cool, assessing gaze on her. "Ethan and I have been working together for the better part of a decade," he said simply. Then he looked at Richard. "Decker, I wasn't aware you'd be here." His tone was glacial. Richard, ever the opportunist, quickly recovered from his shock. 1,000 possibilities were racing through his mind. Had Ethan somehow, impossibly, landed a job with Harrison? Was this his colleague? A desperate hope began to dawn on his face. Perhaps this could be an opportunity. "Mr. Harrison, what a pleasant surprise." Richard boomed, his voice straining to sound casual. He extended a hand. "Richard Decker." We haven't been formally introduced, but I'm a great admirer of your work. In fact, I have a meeting with your associate, Julian Croft, this afternoon." Harrison looked down at Richard's outstretched hand and made no move to take it. "That meeting has been canceled," he said flatly. The color drained from Richard's face. "Canceled? But why?" "Because Julian and I don't do business with thieves," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. The pleasant demeanor was gone, replaced by cold fury. The word hung in the air. "Thieves. Now see here," Richard blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. "I don't know what this is about, but I will not be insulted in this man's house." He gestured at Ethan, his contempt returning by reflex. "Oh, I think you will," Ethan said, his voice cutting through Richard's sputtering. He had remained silent during the exchange, letting the scene play out. Now it was his turn. He picked up the signed document from the table. "This is a contract for the sale of my family's land," Ethan explained to Harrison, though of course, Harrison already knew. "Richard has generously offered me $50,000 for 100 acres. Harrison raised a silver eyebrow. He looked at Richard with an expression of profound disgust. "50,000? For the Nightingale parcel? Decker, are you insane, or just monumentally stupid?" "Nightingale parcel," Richard repeated, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "What are you talking about? It's a worthless patch of dirt." "That worthless patch of dirt, as you call it," Ethan said, his voice like ice, "is the designated site for the new highway interchange, a fact that becomes public record in, he glanced at the clock, about 5 minutes. Its appraised value as of this morning is not $50,000. It's closer to 25 million inch. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a collapsing building, the moment after the load-bearing walls have turned to dust. Clara made a small, choking sound. Marcus sank into a chair, his face pale. Richard stared at Ethan, his mind refusing to process the information. 25 million. That's not possible, Richard whispered. "The zoning reports. The preliminary reports you bribed a low-level clerk for were incomplete," Ethan said, his voice merciless. "The final report, the one you didn't have access to, tells a different story. But you knew it was worth more. You just didn't know how much more." He let that sink in. He let them feel the sheer scale of their miscalculation. Then he delivered the next blow. "You mentioned you were hoping to partner with Ethelred on your new tower, Richard." Ethan continued, his tone conversational. "You said they were the best in the business. Elusive, expensive, worth every penny." He quoted Richard's own words back to him. "What about it?" Richard snarled, his mind still reeling. Ethan smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Mr. Harrison, you know the principle of Ethelred, don't you?" "I do," Harrison said, a grim smile of his own appearing. "I'm looking right at him. Of all the revelations, this was the one that broke them. It was a concept so alien, so completely outside their frame of reference, that their minds simply could not accommodate it. Ethan, the quiet, failed artist, the man they had mocked and belittled for years. He was Ethelred, the legendary, visionary architect they had been idolizing and desperately trying to court. Clara stared at Ethan as if she had never seen him before. The man she thought she knew had evaporated, replaced by this terrifyingly calm, powerful stranger. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not true. You're lying. Am I?" Ethan picked up his grandfather's folio. He opened it to the back. He pulled out the final document, his sworn, notarized affidavit. "This is a statement I prepared for my lawyer, Ms. Isabella Rossi," he said. He began to read, his voice clear and steady, each word a hammer blow. "On the evening of October 12th, at approximately 8:15 p.m., in the residence of Richard and Eleanor Decker, I overheard the following conversation between my wife, Clara Vance, and her father, Richard Decker." He read their words back to them. Clara's triumphant. "Once he signs, we take everything Richard's smug approval. That's my girl. A true Decker." He finished reading and placed the paper on the table. The moral mirror. He had forced him to look at it, and the reflection was hideous. You heard that?" Clara stammered, her face ashen. The last of her composure crumbled. The polished facade shattered, revealing the frantic, grasping desperation underneath. "I heard everything," Ethan said. "I've been hearing you for 3 years. I just finally decided to listen." He then turned his attention back to Richard, who was slumped in his chair, looking 100 years old. "So you see, Richard," Ethan said, gesturing to the contract Richard had so eagerly signed. "This wasn't just a land sale. You signed a contract with me, with Ethelred. And Clause 7b, the conditional partnership audit you didn't bother to read? You just triggered it. By attempting to do business with Ethelred, you have given my legal team full and immediate access to every financial record, every email, every document in your entire company. I wonder what they'll find when they look into your preliminary zoning reports or the accounting on your last 5 projects." Richard made a gasping sound, like a fish pulled from the water. He understood. It wasn't just that he had lost the land. It wasn't just that Ethan was Ethelred. It was that he had, with his own signature, handed his greatest enemy the keys to his kingdom and a map to all its buried secrets. He had just signed his own death warrant. The beautiful, sunlit living room had become a tomb. The air was thick with the ashes of the Decker Empire. Richard sat catatonically, his face a mask of gray despair. The blustering, arrogant titan of industry was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out old man who had just watched his entire world burn down around him. He stared at the contract on the table, the one bearing his proud, flourishing signature. It was no longer a symbol of his victory, but the instrument of his ruin. Clara was the first to break. Her shock curdled into a desperate, frantic panic. She scrambled from the sofa and fell to her knees in front of Ethan, a gesture so theatrical and abject it was pathetic. She grabbed his hand, her touch now repulsive to him. "Ethan, please," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. I didn't mean it. It was just talk. Dad. He gets these ideas in his head. He pushed me into it. You know how he is." Ethan looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, not even satisfaction. Just a vast, empty distance. He gently but firmly pulled his hand away from her grasp. "No, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of heat. "This was you. Those were your words. We take everything. He'll be left with nothing but his precious drawings. This was your plan. Your greed." Richard just gave a voice. "But I love you," she cried, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed even in her desperation. "Edel, we can fix this. We can tear up this paper. We can go back to how things were." "Go back?" Ethan asked, a humorless smile touching his lips. "Go back to you being embarrassed by me in public? To your father mocking my life's work? To you whispering with him about how to defraud me? There is no going back, Clara. You burned that bridge. You burned this whole house to the ground. You just didn't realize I was the one who owned it." Her sobs devolved into incoherent pleading. It was a sound he had never heard from her before. The sound of true, utter defeat. The sound of a person who had lost everything and knew, with sickening certainty, that it was entirely her own fault. Marcus, who had been frozen in his chair, finally found his voice. It was not the voice of a sycophant, but of a terrified child. "What's going to happen, Dad?" he whimpered, looking at his father. "What's going to happen to the company? To us?" Richard didn't answer. He just stared into space, his empire collapsing in his mind's eye. The illegal accounting practices, the corner-cutting on material specs, the network of bribes and kickbacks he had so carefully constructed over decades. Ethan's lawyers would find it all. It wasn't just financial ruin he was facing. It was prison. It was then that the silent enabler finally spoke. Eleanor, who had been sitting perfectly still on a love seat in the corner, a porcelain statue of denial, looked at her husband. Her voice was thin, brittle, like a dry leaf skittering across pavement. "I told you, Richard," she whispered, her words barely audible. "I told you years ago. Your pride, your contempt for anyone you thought was beneath you. I told you one day it would destroy you." She wasn't looking at Ethan or Harrison. She was looking only at her husband, the man whose cruelty she had silently sanctioned for a lifetime. You never saw the man. You only saw his status. And you were wrong. Her words, quiet as they were the final verdict. The condemnation from within his own family. Richard flinched as if she had struck him. Robert Harrison, who had been watching the family's dissolution with a grim expression, stepped forward. He addressed Richard directly, his voice ringing with finality. "Decker," he said, "as of this moment, Harrison Holdings is formally severing any and all preliminary discussions with your company. Furthermore, I will be making a public statement this afternoon announcing that we have uncovered evidence of potential fraudulent activity connected to your proposed waterfront development. I will be recommending the city attorney's office open a full investigation." He then turned to his own lawyer, Peterson, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "And you, Mr. Peterson, I'd advise you to find new representation. Your association with Mr. Decker's business practices is about to become a significant liability. You may even be considered an accessory." Peterson went pale and began frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase, eager to flee a sinking ship. Ethan stood up. The scene was complete. The objectives had been met. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to do here. This chapter of his life was over. He walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up the ridiculously ornate clock, the housewarming gift from the Deckers. He walked back to Clara, who was still crumpled on the floor. He held out to her. "Here," he said, "take this. You value things. You should have it." She stared at the clock, uncomprehending. He placed it on the floor beside her. Then he turned and walked toward the door, Harrison following him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The image of their shattered arrogance was permanently etched into his mind. As he stepped out of the house and into the bright midday sun, he took a deep breath. The air had never tasted so clean. He had not raised his voice. He had not resorted to their tactics. He had simply held up a mirror, and they had shattered themselves against their own reflection. Harrison clapped him on the shoulder, a solid, reassuring weight. "Are you all right, son?" Ethan looked at the clear blue sky. He thought of his grandfather, of the worn leather folio, of the legacy of quiet strength he had been given. "I'm better than all right, Robert," he said, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "I'm free." The car ride away from the house was quiet. Harrison drove, navigating the suburban streets with a practiced ease. Ethan stared out the window, watching the manicured lawns and identical houses blur past. It was a world he had occupied but had never belonged to. A world built on appearances, on a fragile crust of wealth over a void of character. He had just punched a hole through that crust, and the relief was immense. "Isabella Rossi is already moving," Harrison said, breaking the silence. "Her team is filing the injunctions and submitting the audit request to Decker Developments Board. By market close this afternoon, Richard's assets will be frozen pending investigation." Ethan nodded. "And the affidavit? It's been logged as supporting evidence. The district attorney's office is already interested, especially with my public statement backing it up. The conspiracy to commit fraud charge is the least of his worries. What Rossi expects to find in his books, that's what will truly bury him." Ethan thought of Richard's face, that mask of gray despair. He had wanted justice, not destruction, but he was beginning to understand that for a man like Richard, they were one and the same. His entire identity was built on his power and wealth. To strip him of that was to strip him of everything. "What about Clara?" Ethan asked, the name feeling strange on his tongue. Harrison glanced at him. "Rossi will file the divorce papers on your behalf Monday morning, citing conspiracy to defraud a spouse, among other things. The prenuptial agreement you both signed is now worthless, given her actions. She'll be lucky to walk away with her clothes and whatever is in her personal bank account. The house, the joint assets, they're all part of the marital estate you funded, primarily through your Ethelred income. She contributed nothing. She will get nothing. Nothing. He'll be left with nothing but his precious drawings, her own words, her own prophecy turned back upon her. The poetic justice was so perfect it was almost cruel. Almost." They drove on, leaving the suburbs behind and heading toward the city, toward the gleaming towers that Ethan had secretly built. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were re-entering his own life from a great distance. For 3 years, he had lived a lie, pretending to be small to make others feel big. The act was over. A few weeks later, the dust had begun to settle, revealing the stark, new landscape. The downfall of Decker development was swift and brutal. The investigation triggered by Harrison's statement and Rossi's audit unearthed a decades-long pattern of corruption. Richard was arrested, his face gracing the front page of the city's newspapers, no longer as a titan of industry, but as a common criminal in a suit. He made bail, but his reputation was irrevocably destroyed. His business partners deserted him, his lines of credit were cut, and his company entered a death spiral from which it would never recover. Marcus, implicated in some of the lesser schemes, was forced to testify against his own father in exchange for a plea deal. He lost everything, his life of unearned luxury evaporating overnight. He was last seen working as a sales associate at a high-end car dealership, a ghost of his former self, forever trying to sell a lifestyle he could no longer afford. Eleanor, in a surprising act of self-preservation, divorced Richard immediately. She quietly liquidated her personal assets and moved to a small, unassuming town on the coast, disappearing from the society pages she had once graced. She had enabled a monster for 40 years, and when the monster fell, she simply walked away from the wreckage. And Clara, her fate was perhaps the most poignant. Stripped of her husband's hidden wealth and her father's tainted fortune, she was left with precisely what she had planned for Ethan: next to nothing. The society friends she had cultivated vanished. The invitations stopped coming. She was forced to sell the jewelry, the designer clothes, the symbols of a life she had not earned. She took a job as an event planner at a mid-range hotel, a position that forced her to serve the very people she once considered her peers. Ethan heard from a mutual acquaintance that she was bitter, angry, and utterly incapable of understanding her own role in her downfall. She told everyone that her husband had tricked her, that her father had been framed. She remained trapped in the prison of her own narrative, a victim in a story of her own making. Ethan, by contrast, finally stepped into the light. At a press conference alongside Robert Harrison and the mayor, he was publicly revealed as the visionary architect Ethelred, the driving force behind Project Nightingale. The project, built on the land his grandfather had so cherished, was a model of sustainable, community-focused development. It included not just a state-of-the-art corporate campus, but also public parks, affordable housing units, and a vocational training center. He sold his old house, the one filled with Clara's ghosts, and moved into a simple, elegant apartment downtown. He poured his energy into his work, not just the massive Ethelred projects, but his smaller, public-facing firm as well. He found a renewed joy in designing a small home for a young family, and helping a local library expand its children's wing. He had never needed the fame, but he found that using his influence for good was a source of deep, quiet satisfaction. One afternoon, months later, he was visiting the construction site of Project Nightingale. The foundations were laid, and the first steel beams were rising toward the sky, a skeleton of future promise. He was standing on a ridge overlooking the site, the old leather folio tucked under his arm. He had the deed back, now safely in his name, free and clear. He opened the folio and looked at the old, creased paper at his grandfather's spidery signature. He thought about the Deckers. He felt no lingering anger, no sense of triumph, only a profound sense of melancholy. They had been given so much: wealth, opportunity, family, and they had squandered it all in their grasping pursuit of more. They had mistaken his patience for passivity, his kindness for weakness. They never understood that true strength isn't about how loudly you shout, but how long you can endure, how solidly you can build your foundations on integrity and truth. He looked out at the rising structures, the tangible result of his vision, his work, his quiet perseverance. He hadn't destroyed the Deckers. He had simply allowed them to be who they were, in a room with a mirror. They had done the rest themselves. The best revenge he thought, wasn't to be unlike the person who wronged you. It was to be so completely and unapologetically yourself that their world, built on lies, simply couldn't exist in the same space. It crumbled under the weight of its own falsehood. And in the quiet that followed, he was free to build something real, something honest, something that would last. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the nascent city he was building, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the fiery satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet, deep warmth of vindication. It was the feeling of a world set right, of balance restored. He had walked through a fire of his own making, a controlled burn designed to clear out the rot and decay, and he had emerged on the other side, not unscathed but whole. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. He was the architect of it. The journey had taught him a lesson that resonated with the foundational principles of his craft. A structure built on a weak or corrupt foundation is doomed to fail. It doesn't matter how beautiful the facade is, how opulent the decorations are. Sooner or later, the weight of its own dishonesty will bring it crashing down. The Deckers had built their lives on a foundation of greed, arrogance, and contempt. Their collapse was not a matter of if, but when. Ethan had simply been the catalyst, the gentle, persistent pressure that finally exposed the fatal cracks in their design. He ran his hand over the worn leather of his grandfather's folio one last time before placing it back in his briefcase. The folio was more than just a container for a deed. It was a symbol. It represented a legacy of quiet dignity, of honest work, and of the enduring value of things that cannot be bought or sold. His grandfather, a simple carpenter, had understood this better than Richard Decker, a supposed titan of industry. True worth is not measured in stock portfolios or square footage, but in character, in integrity, in the respect you give and the legacy you build. In the aftermath, Ethan made a conscious choice not to become a recluse, shielded by his wealth and success. He did the opposite. He became more engaged, more present. He took on a teaching position at the city's university, mentoring young architecture students. He wanted to instill in them not just the principles of design, a sense of aesthetics and function, but also a sense of ethics. He taught them that the most important thing they could ever build was a reputation for honesty. Your name, he told a lecture hall full of bright, ambitious young minds, is the most valuable asset you will ever have. It is your brand, your bond, and your legacy. Protect it. Build it with the same care you would use to build a skyscraper. Use the strongest materials, integrity, honesty, and respect. Because a reputation, once compromised, is the hardest structure to ever rebuild. He spoke from experience, from the heart of his own story. He saw flickers of understanding in their eyes. He hoped he could save some of them from the path the Deckers had chosen, from the seductive belief that shortcuts lead to success. His personal life also began to heal. The wounds left by Clara's betrayal were deep, but they were not mortal. For a long time, he focused on his work and his friendships. He reconnected with old friends he had drifted away from during his marriage, people who had known him before the Deckers, who saw him for who he was, not for what they thought he lacked. He found solace in these authentic connections, in conversations that weren't laced with hidden agendas or transactional motives. About a year after the confrontation, he met a woman. Her name was Dr. Eris Thorne, a historian who specialized in urban development. They met at a symposium where he was speaking about the integration of green space in modern cities. She approached him afterward, not to praise him, but to challenge a point he had made about historical preservation. Their first conversation was a spirited debate, a lively exchange of ideas between two people passionate about their fields. It was refreshing. Eris wasn't impressed by his wealth or his fame as Ethelred. She was interested in his mind, his principles, his perspective. She saw him, the real him, from the very beginning. Their relationship grew slowly, organically, built on a foundation of mutual respect and intellectual curiosity. It was a structure designed to last. One evening, sitting with Eris on the balcony of his apartment, overlooking the city he had helped shape, she asked him about his past. He told her the whole story, from the first condescending dinner to the final, dramatic confrontation. He didn't tell it with anger or bitterness, but as a chapter of his life that had closed, a difficult lesson learned. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. She looked at the lights of the Helios Tower, one of his earliest triumphs. "They never saw you," she said softly. "They looked right at you, every day, and they were completely blind. They weren't just trying to steal your land. They were trying to steal your worth. But they couldn't because it was never something they could touch." Her words perfectly encapsulated the entire ordeal. His worth was not in the land, not in the money, not even in the buildings he designed. It was in his character, his resilience, his unwavering commitment to his own integrity. It was a part of him they could never understand, let alone take. The story of the Deckers became a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms and country clubs of the city. A fable about a proud king who mistook a quiet lion for a lamb and ended up devoured. But for Ethan, it was something more personal. It was his crucible, the fire that had burned away the unnecessary parts of his life and revealed the core of who he was. He had learned that true power isn't about dominance or control over others. It's about self-mastery. It's the quiet confidence of knowing your own value, even when no one else can see it. It's the patience to wait for the right moment and the courage to act decisively when that moment arrives. As he looked out at the glittering expanse of the city, a city that held his secrets and bore his signature, he felt a deep and abiding sense of gratitude. Gratitude for his grandfather's wisdom, for his friend's loyalty, and even, in a strange way, for the Deckers. Their greed and blindness had been the catalyst for his own liberation. They had intended to write him out of his own story, to leave him with nothing. Instead, they had handed him the pen and given him the power to write a new, better ending for himself, an ending built not on revenge, but on redemption, integrity, and the enduring strength of a quiet man who knew his own worth. The best structure, after all, is a life well built. And so, we come to the end of this chapter. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that the way people treat you is a reflection of their character, not your value. Ethan's story shows us that patience and integrity can be the most powerful weapons against arrogance and greed. He didn't sink to their level. He raised the ground beneath his feet until their world crumbled. What do you think is the most important lesson from Ethan's journey? Is it the power of hidden strength, the importance of integrity, or the simple, satisfying truth that sometimes karma delivers its justice with architectural precision? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this community so special. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the underdog, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell, many more journeys to share. Until next time, remember to know your own worth and never let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness.